Hello, everybody. It is an honor to be part of the Tasveer South Asia Lit Fest 2020. I'm here to introduce our main participants of tonight's program. I will go in the alphabetic order. First, we have with us Ayad Akhtar, an American-born playwright, novelist, and screenwriter of Pakistani heritage. Born in Staten Island and raised in Milwaukee, he graduated from Brown University, majored in theater and religion. And then he earned his Masters of Fine Arts in film direction from Columbia University. In 2012, Akhtar published his first novel, American Darwish, a coming-of-age story about a Pakistani-American boy growing up in Milwaukee. American Darwish has been published by now in over 20 languages and was Kirkus Review's best book of the year. Akhtar's first produced play, Disgraced, won the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for Drama and was nominated for the Tony Award for Best Play. Akhtar's second play, The Who and the What, premiered in 2014 and among other places was also staged here in our city, Seattle. His third play, The Invisible Hand, won the Obie Award and was nominated for the New York Drama Critics Circle Award. Akhtar's latest play, Junk, The Golden Age of Debt, was nominated for the Tony Award for Best Play and was awarded the Edward M. Kennedy Prize for Drama. Critics have characterized Akhtar's writings as essential today as the work of Saul Bellow, James Farrell, and Vladimir Nabokov were in the 20th century in capturing the drama of the immigrant experience. Second, we have with us Fatima Bhutto, who belongs to the storied Bhutto family that has, since her great-grandfather, played a central role in the politics of Sindh and Pakistan for over 80 years. Bhutto earned her bachelor's summa cum laude from Barnard College, majoring in Middle Eastern and Asian languages. She received her master's in South Asian Studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London in 2005, where she wrote her dissertation on the resistance movements in Pakistan. Bhutto published her first book, Whispers of the Desert, at age of 15. Her second book, 9:50 a.m., 8th October 2005, marks the moment of the 2005 Kashmir earthquake. It records accounts of those affected. Bhutto's family memoir, Songs of Blood and Sword, was published in 2010. Her first novel, The Shadow of the Crescent Moon, published in 2013, was longlisted in 2014 for the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction. Her second novel, The Runaways, published in 2019, has received wide critical acclaim. In 2019, she also published New Kings of the World, Dispatches from Bollywood, Desi, and K-pop, an introduction to the various pop phenomena emerging from Asia. Through her fiction and non-fiction writing and on the international lecture circuit, Ms. Bhutto has emerged as a critical voice on contemporary questions of identity, culture, migration, and human rights. Third, we have with us Nermeen Shaikh, who's a producer and co-host of Democracy Now! On public radio. She holds a Master's of Philosophy from Cambridge University and has worked at the Sustainable Development Policy Institute in Islamabad, the International Institute for Environment and Development in London, and the Asia Society in New York City. In 2007, she published The Present as History, Critical Perspectives on Global Power, a collection of interviews with world-renowned scholars and public intellectuals speaking on new imperialism, feminism, human rights, secularism, Islam, Post-Colonialism, and the Global Economy. Today, she's counted among the most accomplished international journalists and commentators. Welcome all. Thank you.
Thank you, Tayyab Mahmood, for that very generous introduction. It's an honor and privilege for me to be here with two remarkable writers, Fatima Bhutto, whose book, The Runaways, has just come out in the US, and Ayad Akhtar, whose book, Homeland Elegies, is also just out in the US. So I'd like to begin by asking Fatima, because I actually read this book last year, what prompted you to write the book, and then why did it take so long to come out in the US?
Hi, Nermeen. Hi, Ayad, and hi to everyone who's joining us for this festival. Well, they're two very different answers, but maybe they're connected in some way. The Runaways did come out in India and Pakistan long before it came out in the US. It also came out in the UK and in French before it made its sort of arrival in America. And I'll come back to that in a second. I'll just say that I started to write this book because I started to feel wounded by the way in which Muslims were depicted, particularly in the West, but in media and culture and conversation after 9/11, after the occupations that were launched in its name, after Al-Qaeda, after all these things, it seemed that there was never any serious conversation about radicalism. It seemed there was never any serious discussion about violence. It was always reductive and insulting and pretty offensive. And by the time ISIS turned up around 2014, I think the sort of facade or the veneer of politeness had just been taken off the conversation. So now it was acceptable just to ask, what's wrong with Islam? You know, what's wrong with these people? And we're seeing so much of this again today in France, in Paris. And, you know, I'm from a Muslim country, I grew up in Muslim countries. And I think those of us who are understood that there was something deeply problematic with the way in which religion was being spoken about, the way in which these countries and their histories were being spoken about. And so I started The Runaways really out of that wound, out of feeling alienated and isolated. And I thought, if you've managed to offend me, what damage have you done to people who are religious, to people who are more sensitive than I am? And I wanted to talk about what it was that I think is at the root of radicalism, which is not religion, which is anger. And I think it took so long to come out in America for that reason. I think that it's uncomfortable, that idea. I think it's much easier to just say, well, this is a civilizational problem and these are these people, and you know, it's through no fault of our own that all this keeps happening and we don't have any hand to play in it. And so it took a while, actually, to find a home for it in the US. And I still think it's actually an uncomfortable conversation. I think the way Muslims are spoken about in America is still very, very problematic.
So Ayad, of course, I'd like you to respond to what Fatima said, because your book in part also deals with the question of being a Muslim in America. But first, what Fatima talked about as well, what prompted the book? You've said that you've been wanting to write this book since you were 18 years old. Yeah. So what made it possible now for you to write it?
Craft. I didn't have the craft to do it before. You know, I think being able to mix genres seamlessly, because I didn't want them to not be seamless, being able to write expansively about social history as well as intimate family drama, And to be able to have a language that could encompass all of that was something that just took me a long time to be able to acquire. You know, I wouldn't really have anything to add to what Fatima said. I mean, everything she's saying is true. You know, 19 years after 9/11, we are, you know, people still ask me in interviews, is it hard? I guess it's hard for Muslims in America after 9/11. And my response is, why are we still talking about this? Like, this has happened 19 years ago, and the United States still has not been able to process the wound. And basically, you know, if we see a world where criminals are in power across the planet because the world order has crumbled, in large part, the world order has crumbled because the United States destroyed it out of vengeance, you know, unprocessed pain after 9/11. So why are we talking about this? You know, so yeah, I don't have anything to add to what Fatima said, which is all very true.
So Fatima, could you elaborate on the thing that you said earlier, that extremism or radicalism or whatever term one uses doesn't really have that much to do with religion, but has to do with anger? I mean, that's an argument despite the time that's passed since 9/11, when this term extremism, radicalism became more or less synonymous with Islam, that it's almost impossible to make that argument.
Well, I think whether we're talking about Europe or we're talking about America, you know, study after study after study shows that religion is not a spark to radicalism or extremism. It's an insulator. People with, you know, spiritual foundations and backgrounds are protected from that kind of a life. What we've also found, especially in recent years, you know, ISIS or Daesh or whatever we want to call them, like all kind of modern organization keeping, you know, and they kept a lot of documents. And so when their recruits would come to their training camps, they would sort of quiz them on their religious background. And ISIS's own documents show that most of their recruits had not just a substandard level of understanding of religion, they had below a substandard level of understanding about religion. So these are not religious scholars, these are not people deeply schooled in religious theology who are going to fight in the name of religion. But they are men and women cast out to the fringes of their society. They are people who maybe grew up in Western countries, but who, you know, though they're born in these countries and schooled in these countries, don't feel accepted by these countries. These are, you know, in many cases, people with deep anger issues, who need help, who don't have access to help, and who react violently. French, I think, is Olivier Roy, wrote a book about this in particular and says they're death cultists. They're, you know, dangerous individuals who collect because they're offered something incredibly seductive. The grooming process of radicalism and religious is a very modern grooming. It doesn't say, oh, you know, we're a bunch of psychopaths, would you like to come and join us? What they say is, you don't have a place in your countries. You know, you don't, your countries hate you. They don't want you. They don't respect you. But we're building new societies. And in these new societies, not only will you be respected, you will be kings among men. Come help us build something new where we need you. And all kinds of people, I think, are caught up in that seduction. So that part of the conversation seems clear if you're sitting in a Pakistan or a Syria or, you know, any of these other places. Seem clear in France. It may not seem clear in Belgium, may not seem clear in the Netherlands. But the more one looks into it and the more one talks to Muslims in these countries, I don't think they feel included. And when people are not included, they become vulnerable to any vision of the future that's offered to them, whether that vision is good or bad. They'll take it if they have no other option.
And Ayad, is it your sense? I mean, your book is really about, I mean, it's about a number of different things, but it's also about growing up Muslim in America. Does what Fatima say resonate at all with you as a Muslim?
Well, I mean, I don't think the book is really about growing up Muslim. I mean, there's sections of it that have that. I mean, I think I wrote another book, which I think is more attuned to that. I mean, I think that yeah, of course. I mean, again, as I said, everything Fatima was saying is it's indisputable. You know, the fact that she has to say it and make the arguments and cite the studies, and you know, it just speaks to the sort of widespread, really some form of like group misinformation. It's like a groupthink misinformation. You know, yesterday I had an interview with German radio where, you know, in a book which is an expansive diagnosis of the American ailment and the afflictions that have led to some of the truculent contraries that we're dealing with in this country, I just kept getting the Muslim question over and over again. Muslim, Muslim, Muslim. You know, what about Muslims? What about France? What about this? What about that? And you know, my response to it was, at a certain point, just pushed to a point. I just said, look, the existential threats are not coming from Islam. There are existential threats. They're coming from a post-Enlightenment Western way of life, a civilization that is at the point of destroying our species. Let's stop talking about Islam like it's a problem. You're the problem. So let's talk about that. So to me, I mean, it's like everything that Fatma's saying is true. I'm just sick and tired of talking about it. I don't really want to talk about it anymore. And that's not a comment about this interview. I'm trying to stage or dramatize the real emotion behind all this stuff, which is, if people have any interest in this stuff, then they can go figure it out for themselves, because I'm going to talk about it anymore. Mm-hmm.
Well, Fatma, one of the things that's striking actually when I saw the cover of the American edition of the book is that it's different from the British edition, because the cover of the British edition has a question on the cover itself saying, how far would you run to escape your life? Mm-hmm. That's not on this cover. Explain why you think it was on that, you know, in the initial cover, not on this one. And your characters in the book, the three principal characters. I mean, you portray an extremely complicated array of circumstances that force your characters to flee, to find, in fact, refuge, which is the theme of this literary festival. So that question, the question of how far would you run to escape your life, it's not on this cover, and the circumstances that you look at for why your characters flee to find refuge, whether they're successful or not.
Well, I'm sure, as Ayad will confirm, writers are never really asked what goes onto the cover of the books. I mean, we're lucky.
We sometimes find out post ex facto. Yeah.
And I mean, I consider myself lucky if I get the title I want, wow. Or in fact the cover. But I think that decision, that we didn't know about it until it had happened, I think it's an interesting one, because for me, The Runaways is not just a book about religion or radicalism. I think it's a book about young people. I think it's a book about millennials and millennial culture. And that is one of fleeing in many ways. That's one of performance. It's one of obscuring, at the same time as this sort of frantic search for the self, you know. Who are we? It's such a strange question that people have to answer every day. They've got to perform that answer, and they've got to be that answer, and they've got to make it more interesting and, you know, more viral and more gripping every moment of their lives. And it's exhausting. And I think it means that at some point we're always running. We're always trying to outrun the self that we've created or that we've imagined. And so one would have to ask Penguin why they chose that line, but that would be my answer.
And Ayad, your book, I mean, I understand that you know, being a Muslim is not the central part of it by any means, but the thing is, it's about a number of different things, including, and I don't know whether you would say this is the central focus or whether it really matters what the central focus is, but it's that to follow up on what you said earlier about what the cause, and of course there are multiple, for the present crisis. And one of the ones that you identify and elaborate on is a critique of American market capitalism, from debt to the financial crisis, wealth inequality, and so on. So talk about the significance of that, I mean, in your own view, and how it's so important for key characters in the book, including the narrator and his experience.
Sure. Thanks for that. My parents came here in the late 60s, and, they're no longer with us. My mom died a few years ago. My dad died last year. So they were here really 50 years. And, that half century, America changed a lot in that half century. And I think that, one of the things I wanted to do was to try to understand a little bit better what had changed and what had changed between the country that they came to, that they thought they were coming to. What country did they discover that they were in? And then what country did that become? And how did that change them? And what did that mean for us, the kids who grew up here, American born and whatnot? And it seemed to me, this is a preoccupation I've had for 15 years, trying to think about this systematically. And to me, the through line is the shift in ideology around money. I mean, it isn't, sure, it's capitalism, but it's even more than that. It's the American way, it's the American dream. It's how all of that is conceived. It's how success is conceptualized and idealized in this country. How incentives from the business sector have transformed higher education, how they've transformed healthcare, how they've transformed all sorts of things. So that thinking, whether it's coming from MBAs or whether it's coming from investment banking, or whether it's coming from advertising, or whether it's coming from debt payment, or whether that's a wholesale shift in the philosophical bedrock of the country. And I wanted to dramatize that shift. I wanted to show how there is a through line between this idea of American opportunity, which is in a sense what I guess drew my parents to some degree, and how the substratum of that really was prosperity at the end of the day, and how from that seed of American opportunity as prosperity, as the ability to prosper in this country and to have the freedom to prosper, if you will, a wholesale transformation of American life was born through the franchise of debt, ennobling privatization, individual acquisition of wealth, and the despoiling of our industrial and economic infrastructure in order to make people rich. I mean, that's what America has become. And so the argument of the book is that, sure, it was hard for Muslims in America after 9/11, there's no question, but that didn't prepare me to understand what had really happened in this country. It wasn't really until I started seeing what was happening to the entire country, not just to the Muslims in this country, that I started to get a picture of a republic that was crumbling for very, very real, concrete reasons. I think that there might actually be an interesting conversation that links those causes to the kind of anger that Fatima is talking about, and which may have to do with, a much deeper source of a kind of current of discontent, disenfranchisement, and anger across the planet, which may see, the so-called death cults and whatnot may just be canaries in the coal mine for what's ahead. But that's a different conversation, obviously, and one that is very hard to have with anybody in this country. So, because we still don't understand what 9/11 is all about. I mean, it's extraordinary to me.
And Fatma, so if you could say, respond a little bit to what Ayad said in particular, because you look, one of the circumstances that you look at, it's not just, cultural alienation or the feeling of being outside, excluded, condemned in the societies of which some of the characters are a part, but it's also, of course, poverty, inequality. So what we see in America is kind of a microcosm, or one could say in a more complicated way that it's a form of capitalism that has now engulfed more or less the entire planet. And so the inequality that Ayad is saying is so operative here is also operative elsewhere, which your characters experience.
Yeah, I think it's a global condition, as Ayad says. It's not limited by any means. The total degradation, the raging inequality. This is a global sickness, and one of the characters in The Runaway, well, maybe more than one character in The Runaways, is her actions are motivated by absolutely being cast out of a society that renders her invisible, that refuses her any space, that actually cannot. I mean, I don't know what the word is for it. It's ugliness, it's a violence that's not spoken about enough. We don't have the language for it the way we do with wars and with death cults and with these other things. But I do think that it's something impossible to ignore in the conversation of belonging, in the conversation of suffering, in the conversation of extremism, of radicalism, and of the political ugliness that's present everywhere in the world, whether in the American elections, which are days away. At the heart of that is so much inequality, so much of people's anxieties about whether they'll be able to live, whether they have the ability to feed families in a month's time. And of course, I mean, COVID has made all these anxieties more fraught, but they were pretty fraught before COVID, I would argue.
If I can respond to something Fatima just said. So, you know, that's exactly right, that we don't know how to talk about some of this stuff, some of the evolving, the nature, the dynamics, the mechanisms, and the poetics, if you will, of the evolving corporate totalitarian order, right? Which is really what we're talking about on some level. And it seems to me that what my book is attempting to do is attempting to formulate a kind of poetics of this predation, and trying to speak and write into narrative corners of that, and to give shape to a way of thinking about how incentive has shifted aspiration as well as action, what people do and how they orient themselves in their lives and what that leads to. And in my case, I'm spending a lot of time talking about people who have the freedom to align themselves with a system that will benefit them. And I think that anybody who doesn't do that is probably stupid, unfortunately. I mean, if you have to feed your family or figure out how to make your way in life, you're gonna probably make the choice to figure out how to do those things. And if the system doesn't really offer you a ton of options to do it in a way that is not predatory, then you will choose the predatory path. And so I think that bind is part of what the book is dramatizing. And I think to, you know, problematic effect for the reader. I think the reader, to the extent the reader believes that the narrator's me, because he has my name and many of the facts of my life, you know, I think it's a complex and relationship with that narrator, and one that we're not always sure that we trust. And that's rightly so, because think about capitalism, it's very easy to criticize it, and it's of course even easier to enjoy its benefits. And that's the double bind that we're all in.
Well, I mean, you talked about that, the form, what this novel might allow, or novels in general may allow one to say about, you know, giant issues like capitalism. I mean, you've written plays before, also another novel. Is there something about writing a novel? It's a novel, it's not a play, it's not a memoir, that gave you a kind of freedom to say things that these other forms would not have?
I think so. I mean, you know, it's interesting. When I was writing the book, I started, and I guess that overture was close enough to my life that I could maybe kind of think to myself that I was writing a memoir. And then I wrote the first chapter, and it sort of very quickly became something very different than a memoir. But when I remember showed it to my agent for the first time, he said, "What the hell is this? I don't understand what this is. Is it a collection of short stories? Is it a memoir? Is it a novel?" I said, "Well, I don't know. Let's just call it a novel." So I'm not sure I knew what it was as I was writing it. And in part, I think that freedom allowed me to be direct in my attempts to affect the relationship I was having with the reader. I didn't want there to be a kind of stable position vis-a-vis the reader and the narrator, because I wanted to speak directly with immediacy and fury about what had happened. I mean, it's insane. We're talking about a peaceful transfer of power in the United States. Last time that happened was a civil war. I mean, what is going on? So something's happening. And to me, the genesis, you know, the Chinese have a proverb, goes something like this. You may have heard it. In a house where the son kills the father, the causes do not lie between the morning and the evening of a single day. So what's happened in this country is not something that came about in 2015. So there's a long genesis to this, but again, now we somehow think if we can get him out of office, and yes, he is the cancer at this point that needs to be removed, but that cancer had an ideology that predated the cancer and that brought this cancer upon us. And getting rid of the cancer is not going to take care of the fundamental problem. So.
And Fatima, for you, the novel, I mean, you've written several, but what I found one of the most remarkable things about this novel is that the characters that you represent, and you represent so well the psychological, emotional complexity of these characters, their interactions with one another, and more importantly, their internal, the internal worlds of these characters that drive them to make the choices they do, even though, I mean, it becomes apparent in the book without giving away too much that those aren't, as it were, choices of their own choosing. These are characters that, in a way, are very remote from the lives that we live. So, you know, how did you do research for the book? And what inspired, I mean, there are three principal characters, but if you could just talk about any one of them, the inspiration.
Yeah, I think that the research was interesting for the Runaways because there was a kind of internet that's vanished when I started writing this book. You had a lot of these Tumblr pages and Reddit threads and websites that hosted a lot of this material that's just gone, that's been wiped. And of course, you can still get the propaganda videos, and you know, there are places you can, like LiveLeak, which is not a website most people watch, but it's a kind of, I mean, it's like YouTube with less animal videos, I think, though they also have sneaking panda videos, but they have like tabs that are Chechnya, Syria, you know, Iraq, and so that stuff is still there, but a lot of the other stuff's gone. So a lot of these young men that would go off to join ISIS would have like Ask Me Anythings on Twitter. And it's that same thing, you know, they want to be famous, they want to be seen, and they wanted to have, yeah, well, they just wanted to have a bunch of boring fans on the internet. And so they would host these things, these question and answer evenings, which I was able to find and use. And that stuff was interesting because it wasn't that they were convincing or persuasive about politics or about military knowledge. They weren't. What they were was just lonely, you know, like they talked about like food they missed all the time. They spoke about their mothers a lot. They spoke about cats a lot, you know, a lot of them had pet cats. And in fact, Cats of Jihad was an actual hashtag popular amongst ISIS fighters. So that stuff was sort of, you know, the best part of the research. But the rest of it didn't really need to be researched because it's just, you know, the things you pick up living between cities and countries and times. I was a student in New York when 9/11 happened, and doing my master's in London when 7/7 happened. And then, of course, being in Karachi, which, as you know, Nermeen, is a place where you don't lower your eyes for a second. There's too much going on. You can't. So all these things that had bothered me and disturbed me and affected me in some way or the other made their way into the book. One of the characters, I suppose, would be Anita Rose. And Anita's a young girl who lives in a colony, in a slum in Karachi. And Karachi's, you know, a mega city. It's an enormous metropolis, just heaving with people. And it doesn't allow you, I mean, I don't know. The only thing I can say is, Ayad, do you know Karachi?
I mean, I've spent time there. Growing up, we would go there. So yes, somewhat, but I'm not an expert at all.
Are you like a Lahore person or a Karachi person?
Yeah, no, more. My dad was Lahore. My mom Islamabad, Rawalpindi. So that was but we had family in Karachi, so we would visit. We would spend 3 or 4 days in Karachi every time we were there. So
because like Lahore is another planet, like if you're describing Pakistani city.
Very different vibe.
Totally different vibe. And in Karachi, the thing I love about Karachi is that it doesn't have any of the like soft edges of Lahore. It's not possible to hide from Karachi, even in the best neighborhood of Karachi with all the, skyscrapers and malls and whatever. There's no hiding from this ferocious poverty, this sadness that engulfs everything. Whereas Islamabad is a city that can hide it.
Of course.
Right? Or
it's designed, it was designed to hide it.
there you go. Or Lahore is a city that thinks it hides it. But
Right,
do a good job of it. And so just a lifetime of Karachi went into Anita Rose's story, and all the things that hurt me about my city to put into her story somewhere, which is nice when you're able to do that. It's not often you get a place to put in all the things that hurt you.
And so, I mean, one of the things, it's difficult to miss, obviously, in both the texts, that, politics in a way suffuses the narratives in different moments more acutely, in some moments implicitly. So Ayad, you've said in another context that having a political opinion is a liability for an artist. So could you explain why and how you've attempted in your work to transcend your own political orientation, and whether you feel you've been successful in doing so in this book?
I'll demur on the last question. I'll let other people decide that. I do believe that as artists, I'm not sure that we're the best spokespersons for outright political views. My great mentor, if I can be so bold as to call him a mentor, is Shakespeare. And Shakespeare's the one that I read every day and who I've learned the most from. And I know, I constantly talk about Shakespeare, and it causes me no end of grief, because I know that critics think I'm trying to make myself look better, and audiences sort of their eyes glaze over. It's like, oh, Jesus, going to talk about Shakespeare. That means it's going to be boring. But the reality is Shakespeare is the best. I mean, as Stephen Booth says, trying to compare Shakespeare to other poets is like comparing King Kong to other monkeys. And it's true. Actually, when you really do read Shakespeare deeply, that is the fact. And, you could never divine from Shakespeare what his political point of view about anything is. When he's writing about kingship or when he's writing about power, he's writing from the perspective of a usurped king and the dramas and the rightness of that perspective. And when he's writing about the underclass, he's writing from that perspective. And you wouldn't know if he was Catholic or Protestant. I mean, perhaps the one political flaw that Shakespeare might have had is as indicated by his portrayal of Joan of Arc in Henry VI. He kind of had an anti-French thing, maybe, kind of. So there's a bit of a jingoism every now and then that appears in Henry V. But it's hard to not recognize the commercial instinct of somebody who's trying to sell tickets. So anyway, all of this is to say that in order to mirror and to reflect characters deeply, their essences, their aspirations, their ideals, everybody's right from their own perspective. And I don't know that there's any value in me as an artist. It's way above my pay grade anyway, to be able to tell people what kind of a political opinion they should have. That said, in this book, there is a lot of outrage and there's rage about what's happened to America. I'm not sure it's partisan. I think that there's just as much ire toward the left as there is to the right here. And if I had to evince, if the book evinced some politics, it's probably a kind of, it's going to sound like a paradox and maybe a mindless one, but a kind of Burkean anarchism at the core of the book. And I think it's because it's an attempt to try to recognize what we've lost. We've lost so much. And the question of where to go is not really about the question of how to make society progress. To me, it's about trying to understand what it is we're losing, because we're losing the whole planet. And I don't know the technology is going to save us from that, So that's probably not a direct answer to your question, but I hope it at least speaks to it in some interesting way.
And Fatima, your take, politics and art. Or politics and the art.
Well, I wouldn't force my political opinion on anyone. I don't think that's the role or responsibility of the writer, but I also don't think that art has the luxury of being apolitical at any time, in any place, anywhere. Or at least the art that thinks it's apolitical is art that, you know, has messages that are kind of frightening. But I don't know. I mean, Ayad, you did an event on political fiction, didn't you, recently, which I signed up for, and I've got somewhere on my, because the time difference was so bad.
Yeah, it was something with Marlon and Rachel Kushner.
Yeah, who are such political writers. I mean, maybe writers don't think of themselves as political creatures.
Well, I think
the readers of them, but I don't think. Go on.
Yeah, sorry. I think there's a little bit of delay. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought there was a pause, and I thought you'd stop. I think that work has politics, and that readers will read work and they will see politics in work. And sometimes they're projecting that politics, and sometimes they're over-interpreting that politics, and sometimes, given the cultural moment, a certain strain of something will suddenly emerge and feel political in some new way. But I don't think the inherent dramatic dynamics that make a story good, or the inherent sort of sharpness of characterization that brings a character to life, or that brings a theme home, is fundamentally political. And I think that having too much consciousness about the political dimension of what it is one's writing, the language, the verbiage, if you will, is potentially a liability. That the politics of representation are potentially a liability when it comes to the poetics of narrative or poetic craft. So, I mean, that's just my observation in my own work and in my own life. But, you know, of course, people do see politics in my work, and it outrages some. Certainly from my own community, I get a lot of grief about what they perceive as the politics of my work, which frankly, I don't think is there. I don't think they're reading my work correctly, but whatever, you know, time will tell.
Is there a correct way to read work?
Well, I think that there's an assumption that I am a pre-Edward Saidian, pre-Orientalist writer, that I am somehow in some of my work evincing some kind of naivete about discursive construction around the Muslim other, when in fact that analysis has been fully digested. And so the work is commenting on all of that stuff. But I think that, you know, it might be that my readers are so preoccupied by how they are being represented in front of white people that the issue is not so much what the work is saying, it's how can it be misread by somebody else, which again is not about the politics of the work. That's, you know, that's a whole other thing that's going on. But anyway, it's, you know, neither here nor there. I'm doing fine. I can pay my bills, and that's the important thing. So
I just want to say, Nermeen, just to something that Ayad mentioned just a moment ago as well. I think anytime a writer is self-conscious and is trying to filter in things, of course, it's, as you said, it's disruptive, and what's really moving is character, is struggle, is truth in fiction. But I do think that so much of how we live and how we struggle is naturally political. I mean, I'm thinking of I just got my hands on an early draft of a novel by a wonderful Indian writer, Siddhartha Deb, and I don't think in any page there's a conscious effort to say X over Y, but it's so deeply ingrained in the story and what it means. You know, when a woman moves through a city like Delhi, there's so much politics that is involved in that, and you don't have to be, I think, trying to say anything for it to come through. I think it just comes through.
Well, Ayad, you said earlier, I mean, on the question of, to go on with what Fatma was saying as well on politics, that, you know, you may not intend, you're not intending to have a political voice in your writing, but readers may read whatever they want, one way or the other, and that your community, and I guess I would ask who you're referring to when you say my community, has in some sense misread aspects of what you've written. What about the question of audience? Who, when you think, I mean, the book begins with an overture to America, who is your intended audience? Is there an intended audience? Is the audience intended that which will not misread into your writing a political motive that is not there?
Well, as you've read the book, you recognize that all these questions are active dramatic questions within the book. And so the narrator is struggling with all of the dimensions of this. And I think that when I began this interview and was talking about the craft issue and that I never had the language, what I was really saying was that I never had the patience. I never had the ability to allow opposites to fully coexist, for dissonance to fully not be resolved, to luxuriate in the notes that were happening right now without concern for where they were tending. And so all of the dilemmas that you just outlined, in which I alluded to earlier, are of course, they're the soil of the book, and a narrator who's constantly struggling with people who reward him by misreading his work, and also, with whom he gets into trouble with his own family because they misread his work. Misreading is the essence of reading, isn't it? I mean, that's what Harold Bloom teaches us brilliantly in The Anxiety of Influence. So misreading is not only not a crime, but it is actually probably the deepest creative act. Our misreading is an autobiography in a way. Somebody misreads Wallace Stevens and says he's misreading, he's got it all wrong, goes off and writes his or her own poems, and then that's the birth of a literary voice. That said, the community I was referring to very specifically is the Milwaukee Muslim community, in which I am persona non grata, and my parents and family have been, excommunicated, but my father was very happy about it. And then, so larger American Muslim community, I think there's disparate voices, but I think there's a strong strain of sort of, what I heard was, we were very proud, you won this thing, you won a Pulitzer, and then all of a sudden your play is in our city. And then we go, and our families would go together, and we go to see this thing. We were going to be so happy. And then you attack us on stage in front of all these people. And to which my response is, I don't know what you expect. I'm not a cheerleader. I'm not in advertising. I'm not here to make you look good. I'm not here to make myself look good. I think that a writer has always, a writer worth their salt has always been operated as a conscience of the community, not a booster of the community. At least that's my opinion. I don't take that booster stuff all that seriously. It's not anything that I am inspired by. I don't look to that work in that way. I find that tendency in Shakespeare to be his only flaw, actually. So, I think, again, I haven't answered your question because I've kind of gone off on my own sort of like, whatever obsessions. But that's what I would say, is that I think that in this book, at the very least, all of those contraries and confusing questions are not resolved. And that's because they're not resolved in my life. I mean, I'm writing from where I am.
Fatma.
Well, I think, writers can only write from where they are. And it's I don't know. Whatever I'm writing is something that I'm thinking about myself. I'm not thinking about who's going to read it. I'm just obsessed by something or haunted by something. And writing is the only way I know how to think about something for a sustained period of time.
So let's go to that, the writing as a refuge. Ayad, you've said writing is a refuge for you. Your craft is a refuge for you. You also say on the more literal question of a refuge as it's represented in the book, I mean, obviously it's a very complicated journey that the narrator takes, but it's ultimately in some sense partially resolved by recognizing if refuge and home are synonymous, then America is it. So can you talk about—
Although I will say, Nermeen, I mean, the last two lines of the book, again, we live in an era where it's increasingly, it seems like literary irony is hard to come by. And I don't mean that just with you, it's just in general, it's something that, you know, the second to last line of the book is, I haven't even thought about it. America's my home. Well, the reader has just spent 368 pages watching him think about this. So obviously his response is, it can't be fully vested with, you know, reliability.
Correct.
Right. So,
yeah.
So I mean, and again, that just speaks to the deeper point about allowing contraries and opposites and irresolutions and dissonances to exist. And that for that moment, in that moment of the coda, which requires bringing all of the keys back to the original key and ending the note in the, you know, in the base note of that key. So that's what I do. I mean, it's a formal thing. And it's also, I think it's quite moving to some people, and that's by design also, because we've been through this very sort of tumultuous relationship with the father and all of this sort of stuff. So that said, yes, craft is my home. It's my vice. I have avoided a lot of life by focusing on craft. And, you know, I don't know what to say about it, that thank God it paid off enough that I can pay my bills. I mean, like, that's because that's what it's been for me. I get off on craft in a way that is, I guess, a great gift probably in my life. And I'm happy for that. And that's why I'm a writer. And I've been a writer since I was 15, and it's been 30 some years. So yeah. So that is the refuge. That's the place of belonging.
And Fatima, what about you? I mean, the characters in your book seem, in fact, never to be able to find any refuge. So that's, I mean, what's represented in the book. But then for yourself as a writer, is the craft also the refuge?
Well, yes and no, because you know, when it's going, the craft is, of course, a place of refuge. When you're stuck and you're struggling, it's torture. So no, it's not a refuge for me. I wouldn't call it a refuge. I think, you know, I don't know. I don't believe in belonging. I've always felt a bit rootless, and I don't know if there is a place where one belongs fully, whether it's an imaginary place or a mental place or a spiritual place or a physical place. I just think some kind of flux is valuable and necessary for me in order to survive. I get sort of, you know, itchy if I am forced to belong anywhere too long.
Well, on that question, the question of flux, I mean, we're entering potentially a moment of the greatest flux, at least here in the US, where Ayad and I are. And I'll begin with you, Ayad, because Trump himself is a, you know, quite important character in parts of the book because of the relationship.
He's the spiritual muse of the book.
Right. Because of the father's early acquaintance with him and his support of him to a point. You've said in another context that Trump is, and you've suggested that earlier too, that he's not really the problem, or he is, but he's really the symptom of a much greater problem. And now, you know, we're speaking just, I mean, less than 2 weeks away from the election. Your sense of how this could turn out?
I don't know, Nermeen. I mean, it's, you know, it was interesting. I think before, you know, this sort of mishaps around COVID, the debate in COVID, like it was like 1-2 punch. It felt like it was not clear that Trump was going to lose.
Yeah, absolutely.
It felt to me like there was a kind of, I was sensing anecdotally a kind of, wow, there's a deeper support for him than I realized, you know, which I kind of mirrored the Clinton era, but not exactly, the Clinton campaign, but not exactly, in a different way. But now, I don't know, it just seems like the mishaps and this sort of like, it's just really pathetic. And I feel like a lot of people who want to vote for him just don't seem to be able to muster the will, at least to express it in that way. Now, we'll see what happens on election day, and who knows what's going to happen in terms of this sort of the threat of violence. And, you know, it's clear that there's something that could happen, and I don't know what it would be. And But it seems like, fingers crossed, it's going to be hard for it to be close enough for Trump to call it into question. I think that's my sense of it, but I don't know.
And Fatma, because really the entire world should be involved in this, since whoever becomes the president of the US has a say practically everywhere. So how is this election being perceived, and your own sense of where things might go?
Well, I don't think anyone who is not American is surprised that Trump is president of America. And I certainly thought he would win the first election. In fact, when I was writing The Runaways in 2014, I had one of the characters tweeting to President Trump. And a friend of mine read the book in its early drafts and said, "Don't be ridiculous." Anyways, it had to be taken out because it was sort of 3 pages of tweets, which, this is not a laughing matter. Anyways, but I don't know. I think that Trump has done something valuable, which is that he has taken this mask off of America. And so the America that the rest of the world has always seen now seems to be visible even at home. I'm not convinced he's going to lose. I mean, I might have to eat my words.
In
2 weeks.
Yeah, you might be right.
But I just want to say that I don't know if you saw this story today where there's this Dutch, he's like a social scientist, but this Dutch social scientist or something hacked Trump's Twitter. Did you see this? He hacked Trump's Twitter account in 2016 and he rehacked it now. And he said that in 2016, he was able to hack the Twitter account of the soon-to-be president by guessing his password, which was "you're fired." And now when he got back into his account, he found that the Twitter password was MAGA 2020 ! So,
oh wow, crazy.
I mean, nothing should surprise us anymore. I think we live beyond the age of surprises.
Right.
But yes, you're right. In fact, the Commonwealth, the all citizens of the Commonwealth can vote in British elections by virtue of the fact that you should get something out of 400 years of, robbery, I guess. And it's true. Maybe that can be something the Americans do soon.
Bad chance. Folks in North Dakota are going to let that happen.
Well, irrespective of how this turns out, what will you both be working on? Ayad, another play, another novel, something else entirely?
I'm in the midst of TV land right now. I've got a bunch of TV stuff. I have a big TV show at one of the big streamers, which, we're in the middle of, COVID. It was like all these planes lined up on the runway and then COVID. So, they would like to keep us at the gate as long as possible before they put us on the runway. And so, so there's, right now it's going to be TV, I think, for the next year or two. But, after that, I mean, there is no theater, theaters are not, Broadway will probably not be back or at the earliest 22, 23. And some people, insiders are whispering 23, 24. So
don't say that. No, we can't even.
I'm trying not to, I'm trying not to think about it, but it's unfortunately, when you have that much at stake as a Broadway theater owner or as a Broadway producer, you don't want to make contingency plans that are you want to try to start planning for a period that actually is going to make sense. So that's what the whispers are. If I could just say one real quick thing, I want to make sure I can get it in. In addition to her novel, Fatma has written, I think, one of the really, really most extraordinary analyses of narrative in the world today, which is her new book, The New Kings of the World. So if you haven't read that, you really have to. It's an amazing book. So I just want to get that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very kind.
No,
I was actually going to say, Fatma,
okay. Yeah.
to you. I mean, just last year in the fall, in fact, almost exactly 1 year ago today, we had a conversation about New Kings of the World at the Asia Society here in the city. So the next book, fiction, nonfiction, something else?
Well, thank you, Ayad, for that. I don't know yet. COVID has kind of destroyed a lot of my concentration. But what I have been thinking about, I mean, I would like to do another nonfiction book. But again, besides destroying concentration, COVID means, how do we travel anymore? You know, how do we go out and interview people and research things? And it's all a bit yuck, I guess. But
Yeah.
but yeah, that's the only way I know how to talk about COVID 10 months in. But yeah, I don't know yet. Been taking the year to read and think. But yeah, I'd love to do some more nonfiction.
Well, thank you both so much, Ayad Akhtar, Fatima Bhutto. Here's one book, Homeland Elegies, Ayad, and The Runaways, Fatima Bhutto. On behalf of Tasveer South Asian Literary Festival, I'd like to thank you both for your time. And voila, more
Thank you.
soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're not supposed to go off just yet.
Oh, yeah. You went away pretty quick. Where'd you go?